Good afternoon. This is Introduction to Western Political Thought, and today's class is on Charles Mills and his work, The Racial Contract. Let me pull up my screen. Okay, so we are looking at the concept of sub-personhood, meaning a personhood which is below the level of personhood for other groups or people in society or the world. And you'll notice that I use the same slide deck design that I did when we looked at John Rawls in his Justice is Fairness and his Law of Peoples works. And the reason I did that is because we're going to be looking at Charles Mills directly in conversation with John Rawls. John Rawls is publishing his works in the 1980s. Charles Mills is publishing his works in the early 2000s, and there is a direct correlation here. Rawls proposed, as you recall, I'm not going to review the whole class, but as you recall, Rawls was giving us a framework for how to have justice in society in a post-industrialized, democratic, liberal society like the United States. And his prescription for how to do that involved a number of actions that people in society have to do in order to come together, collaborate, figure out how to approach the question, right? What is justice? What's it going to require in society? In order to arrive at those requirements, Rawls wanted us to do a couple of things. Charles Mills, now because Rawls is coming from a tradition, he's coming from the liberal political tradition, he's coming from the social contract tradition in liberal political thinking. Mills is going to respond in kind using the same framework. And the reason that he names his work The Racial Contract is a play on the words the social contract. And we'll get in a minute to what he has to say about that. But Rawls is furthering this notion that society is a social contract between those people who are subjects and the sovereignty. As you recall, when we looked at the state of nature theses of both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and kind of the differences there and some of the overlap, you'll recall that this notion says that human beings, in nature, we are free to do whatever we want. There is no authority over us, keeping us in check. In a Hobbesian vision, that leads to war and chaos and, the worst part of human nature, which is greed and avarice, just kind of coming to the surface. And there's no security. In a Lockean vision, according to John Locke, it's more of a perfect freedom that we enjoy in the state of nature. But nonetheless, in both thinkers, at some moment, human beings have to graduate, so to speak, from a state of nature to civil society, civilized society. And when they do that, they enter into a social contract with the sovereign. And when Hobbes and Locke were writing, obviously the sovereign was the king and queen. We were absolute monarchies in Europe, and they were creating a new justification for political authority that was not rooted in Christianity. There was no divine right of kings to rule by the 1600s. Why? Because we had gone through Renaissance humanism with the Renaissance, because we had gone a few centuries before that through the Protestant Reformation that kind of brought individualism in salvation to the forefront. With Renaissance humanism, we have the very famous painting by Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the creation of Adam, and that one famous centerpiece, which is essentially an anthropomorphized depiction of God passing off the baton to Adam, the first human created by God, in a way that, it's like a transference of authority. It's like God is the clockmaker argument. And we've talked about this, so I won't go more into it. But God made the world and then gives to Adam the rulership of that world, and then is going to step back from the scene. That was the idea put forward during Renaissance humanism when all of the disciplines of human life activity and thought were being disentangled from Christianity. William Cavanaugh says in his work, The Myth of Religious Violence, that in pre-modernity, right, before this time, in the traditional world, religion was like the overarching criteria and value system. It's what he called a theopolitical whole. Society was both theological and political at the same time, and there was no distinction between the two. But after the Renaissance, we find the situation in which like I said, the areas of life activity have been disentangled from Christianity. And we saw this with Machiavelli when, he puts forward the idea that Christian morality doesn't have a place in dictating or judging the actions of rulers or the prince. So in this case, Charles Mills is going to take what John Rawls has talked about coming from the social contract tradition, and he's going to problematize it on one particular basis, and we'll get to that. So the first thing that we're going to look at is race in relation to individual rights. And one of the things that we know for a fact is that with modernity, again, capital M modernity is a historical epic that begins around the 1700s. And in the world of ideas, it's marked by the Enlightenment, which we've already looked at. And in the world of physical reality, it is utterly transformed through the Industrial Revolution. So modernity ushers in the epic of individualism. We know that, from the Enlightenment onward, with the emphasis on rationality, with the emphasis on moral autonomy with Kant, where each individual is now responsible for making sure that their actions are morally good and they can be universalized. We have um, we have the epic of individualism, right? Whereas before it was more collectivities, it was, society, as we saw with St. Augustine, was a collocation of Christian souls, right? It was a gathering of Christian souls. After Hobbes, we have society is like little atoms colliding against one another, kind of like inside of a pinball machine. And in this epic of individualism, we already saw that there's a Marxist critique that even though the feudal estates have been dismantled as Europe goes through its economic transformations after the colonization of the Americas, and the intra-European economic competition that happens when Spain and Portugal get super rich from plundering the Americas. Then we have France and Spain and France and England and Belgium all competing to have colonial outposts to be able to survive this new economy in Europe, right? To survive and thrive in this new economy of Europe. The Marxist critique said that even though the European economies went through certain transformations, and now feudalism doesn't exist anymore. That mercantilist era comes to an end. Even though you no longer have lords and barons in relation to peasant farmers, now what you have, and we saw this with Marx, is you have workers in factories and capitalists who own the means of production. So the Marxist critique in this era of modernist individualism said, okay, even though politically formations have changed and we don't have feudalism anymore, the exploitative relationships still remain because they're economic. So Marxist critique says that we have a nominally classless society. Nominally means in name only. Classless means we don't have lords and peasants anymore, right? People are on level, right? They're on a level playing field, apparently. So even though they are nominally classless and normatively equal, like the state interprets them in the same way, nonetheless, there are these really sharp economic differences between the capitalist and the working class, right? And that this is a very stark difference of inequality between these two groups. The racial critique during this period of modernist individualism says that people of color can't even attain to the normative equality in such societies because they are part of a sub-personhood group. Sub means below, personhood means they are a person in society, like any other person in society. So Charles Mills is saying we have a model of a social contract, but beneath the social contract is the racial contract. Beneath the social contract that establishes authority in a society between the ruler and the ruled, underneath that is white supremacy, and that people of color don't even get to be at the level of the normative equality with other members of society. Now, here's the definition of white supremacy that we take from Charles Mills. It's a very useful definition. Feel free to use it in your other classes as well. But white supremacy is a system of sociopolitical domination. Okay, sociopolitical here means that it is embedded both in social norms, interactions in society, that which is valued and that which is valued less. And domination is, of course, one group exerting power, influence, in often in oppressive ways over other groups. Now, this system, and it is systemic after all, we're not talking about individual instances, but we're talking about an entire system within society that upholds this particular um, social structure, which is white supremacy. So, white supremacy can be either formal or informal. Now, using the language of the law, formal is de jure and informal is de facto. So, formal is when something is written into the law, right? For example, in the United States, up until the 1970s, in some parts, a black person and a white person could not get married. There were anti-miscegenation laws in the United States, as there were in many other countries, and that was de jure, right? It was written into the law. You couldn't go get a license from the state because the law upheld the policy of anti-miscegenation. But white supremacy is also informal. It's also de facto. We have legal equality under the law for people of all colors in the United States, but we also have several academic studies that show that if two people with comparable resumes apply for the same position, like they have very similar qualifications, very similar job experience. For all other factors, they're equal as applicants to a particular job, but the person whose name sounds like an African American name will get far less chance of getting a call back than the person whose name sounds like a white American name. That would be an example of de facto white supremacy, right? It's not written into the law. It's not written into the bylaws of that company that's looking to hire a new worker. You couldn't find it. You couldn't point to it officially, but nonetheless, it happens on the ground. So that would be de jure and de facto forms of exploitation and domination. Now, white supremacy as this system, which has these dimensions to it, is characterized by racial exploitation and the denial of equal opportunities to non-whites, thereby privileging whites nationally as well as globally. This is a very important point because white supremacy is not only something specific to the American story, it's not just written into the pages, every page of American history from settler colonial times until today. I mean, I think it's fresh off the press that President Trump referred to Representative Ilhan Omar as garbage, right? And made very disparaging remarks about the Somali American community. But so this is not just something that is written into the functioning of the United States of America, but this is on a global level. White supremacy is a system of sociopolitical domination at the global level. And if we look at the countries of the global south and we look at the countries of the global north, if we look at the money lending practices of world financial institutions towards formerly colonized countries, we quickly discern certain types of patterns. White and non-white continues to be a very important factor, socially and politically, both at the global and national levels. So, generally speaking, according to Mills, white supremacy is taken for granted, which means it's not problematized, it's not even identified a lot of times. It's just part of the background, it's part of the foreground. It becomes invisible, right? As Morpheus said in The Matrix, and if you haven't seen The Matrix, go watch it. It's the air that you breathe, right? White supremacy is highly diffused into many, if not all aspects of social functioning, but it's also positively valorized. And we find this in insidious ways in many of the functionings of international bodies of law, of international news media, particular national narratives around refugees in many parts of the world. White supremacy, you can really, once you learn to identify it, you do see it in many different spaces and places. Now, after World War II and after decolonial movements, where most of the colonized world begins to gain its independence from former colonizing countries of Europe, it becomes politically incorrect, what Mills here calls impolitic, right? It becomes politically incorrect to publicly express white supremacist opinions. Now, of course, that's changing with MAGA and the present administration. Now it is once again politically correct in many circles to go ahead and espouse white supremacist views. But after World War II, you really have a shift in the global language and consensus around publicly holding on to white supremacist ideas. And one only has to go and look at what heads of state and thinkers and anthropologists all over Europe and North America had to say about the other countries of the world, the other regions of the world, the colonies, to really see, like, whether it's the theory of the other human beings, which we looked at a little bit when we looked at Carl Linnaeus and the taxonomy of human races. Um, but there are very, you know, terrible descriptions of people from other parts of the world about their cultures, about their beliefs. So up until World War II, it was perfectly acceptable to speak like that. And then afterwards, we see kind of a shift with this new global world order, with the establishment of the United Nations, um, and with this competing cosmopolitanisms, right, which I've talked about before. So this becomes, impractical to speak in this language. And one of the things that we find, Mills says, is that there is a retroactive sanitization of the racist past. Meaning, retroactive means we're doing it today, but we're going back in time and talking about something that happened from before and trying to make a change to that. Sanitization means we're cleaning it up, right? We're scrubbing it of the racist past. So this is a historical revisionism that Mills is referring to, a historical revisionism. We're going into the records of history and we are retelling it in a way that erases or turns the light away from or otherwise, hides or occults some of the terrible racist um, actions and words of the past. So that is happening today, right? Mills says that the leading Western political philosophers and ethicists play their part when they select what to focus on and what to never address to continue to justify Western domination in the world. And this goes to Mills's critique of philosophy, political philosophy in general. Mills is a philosopher himself, and he's speaking about his own discourse that he is a part of. He says that in mainstream political philosophy, that there's this big gap, right? There is a refusal to admit the importance of imperialism and colonialism from history. There is a refusal to connect the dots in the literature to how the colonial past has helped to shape the present. If we look at what countries owe money, huge amounts of debt to international lending agencies, those are countries that were colonized and had their resources stolen from them by the metropole, right, by the colonizing mother countries who became super rich from doing that, right? The United States would not have industrialized at the rate that it did was it not for the stolen labor, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation of what, $3 million worth of enslaved people. And that was back in 1850s money, not in 2025 money. So there's this enormous impact of colonization and imperialism that is never mentioned. It doesn't make its way into any of the accounting books of mainstream political philosophy when it talks about justice. The main, I mean, if you're someone who follows, and we'll do Plato in a few weeks, but if you're someone who, if you are in political philosophy, the main question is what is justice, right? That is the central question. If you follow, the thinking of Plato, that's the main question. And modern political philosophy refuses to even touch colonialism and imperialism in its attempt to grapple with that question of what is justice. In the United States specifically, Mills tells us we have an absurd situation where such a huge philosophical literature on social justice doesn't mention racial justice at all. And racial justice, or the lack thereof, in the United States context, is the biggest form of injustice that we've seen, right? I mean, that and private property and financiers exploiting people who don't own private property. And definitely the one to read on that is Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. But so this is Mills kind of critiquing the discourse that he's a part of for allowing such gaps in understanding to perpetuate and to exist. Now, epistemology of ignorance, you might remember when we were doing John Rawls, this exact slide was used to talk about the veil of ignorance. Just a quick review, John Rawls's concept of the veil of ignorance is that each of us has to separate ourselves to the extent possible from our lived experience, from what is our social location, right? Where do we exist in society? What advantages and disadvantages do we have? And once we've done that and entered into something of an objective state, right, quote unquote objective state, then we can all sit down together, collaborate, and try to come up with what should be the principles of justice. Like, how can justice exist in our society? How can we make America just? We're going to sit down and figure that out together, but each one of us is going to forget where we're coming from, right? And you'll recall that for Rawls, it was extremely important to have a public reasoning, which was distinct from private beliefs. Now, that might not work on someone who's deeply committed to a life of faith, and their faith offers them principles and values that dictate how they should behave in society in the most just possible way, treat their neighbors in a particular way, hold unjust rulers accountable for their injustice, and so on. But nonetheless, coming from the tradition that Rawls is coming from the liberal political tradition, from the social contract theory tradition, he is telling us that we're going to all put on a veil of ignorance and collaborate, and we're going to arrive at what justice requires in society. The idea here is that if I'm not connecting to my own experiences and who I am in society, then I'm going to be able to be objective and figure out what everybody needs. If I'm only connected to my own self and my own experience, I'm going to be pushing forward a selfish vision of what justice requires, right? It'll just be something that serves me and mine. It won't be something that takes everybody into account. So the idea is not bad, but Mills is not buying it. Charles Mills says it's not possible to put on a veil of ignorance. And as a matter of fact, he takes Rawls's term and he turns it into this. He calls it an epistemology of ignorance. Epistemology, you'll recall, is a theory of knowledge. Every civilization's got one, every philosophy's got one. Epistemology answers the question, how do we know what we know? What are the sources of knowledge? How can you tell if knowledge is legitimate or not? And so for Mills, looking at John Rawls, he says John Rawls is putting forward an epistemology of ignorance, right? A knowledge system of ignorance. He says that systems of domination affect us not only through material advantage and disadvantage, but also in how unfair social privilege reproduces itself through people learning to see and feel about the world in ways that accommodate injustice. So we perpetuate the norms of injustice and the cultures of injustice and some of the values of injustice, right? We embody them, perhaps without realizing it, and then we replicate them. And there are many examples of this, studies that have been done, particularly with respect to racial justice, where, the famous study of little girls being asked to choose dolls based on certain questions and prompts that they were given, a black doll and a white doll, and it didn't matter if the respondents were young black girls or young white girls, the responses were all comparably the same. When they were asked, which doll is beautiful, they would reach for the white doll. When they were asked which doll is ugly, they would reach for the black doll. When they were asked which doll was good, they would reach for the white doll. When they were asked which doll is wicked, they would reach for the black doll, and so on. So that would be an example of what Mills is saying here. Unfair social privilege reproducing itself through people learning to see and feel about the world in particular ways, right? Now, the contemporary view of structural and historical racism. Modernity, the same time period, right, from the 1750s till today, is cognitively marked by a broad pattern in which whites generally endorse racist views in the period of formal global white domination. So to be cognitively marked means in the realm of thinking, in the realm of ideas and how people think. Modernity is marked by the thinking of people. We find in that thinking a broad pattern in which whites generally endorse racist views, and it's a type of ignorance, right? Because we do live in a time of formal global white domination. But after World War II, and after this decolonial shift that happens with independence across the colonized world, there is a more subtle stance that emerges, which in name, again, nominally means in name only, right? So the shift in the thinking is that Nominally, we all decry racism, right? It's politically incorrect to be racist. Everybody has to pay the piper, kiss the ring. Everybody has to say racism is wrong. We used to be racist. We've learned our lesson. We've moved on. And now we live in a post-race America. You'll remember the jubilation when President Obama was elected. It was a sense that we have overcome racism. Um, Not to underplay the importance of electing the first Black president of the United States, it is an important event. But the idea that it signals that we live in a post-race America is completely absurd and untrue. So in this post-World War II shift, we nominally decry racism. Nominally, we say that no, racism is bad. But at the same time, we downplay the impact that racism, in historically speaking, has had and continues to have on the present day, right? The past is present. Yes, we don't have chattel slavery in the United States anymore, but what we have are the vestiges of that slavery, right? We have the impact, the legacy, the very structural pieces that have come to us through history to the present day that can be traced back to that form of exploitation and oppression. So this is a different type of ignorance. One type of ignorance is for white people to generally uphold racist views, and up until World War II, that was definitely the case. It was the norm to have ideas about racial superiority and inferiority, with white people being like the crown. But after World War II, we have another type of racism, which is that in name, we say no to racism, but we don't fully assess the impact of racism. Now, continuing on with the structural and historical um, racism and how people view it today, number one, the idea is that remedial measures of racial justice are not necessary. So, according to this new post-World War II view, in which we say racism is bad, but we don't necessarily understand it or see its impacts, um, we say that remediation is not needed, right? Why do we need to talk about racism if we're post-race now? Like we got over that problem. We don't need to do anything about it. If you're not familiar, you can look into some of the debates around reparations in the United States context, right? The arguments for reparations are very strong. They're very compelling, right? It's an actual case that is made. The arguments against it are, why should I have to pay for something that people hundreds of years ago did and I had nothing to do with that? And this would be an interesting topic for us to take up in the discussion portion. But another idea that belongs to this new view is that white privilege, which really comes to us from structural advantage, like it's built in systematically, like property laws, right? And how they changed over time, how property stayed in a family, illegitimate wealth that was accrued through things like chattel slavery, through things like even today we have in the Bushwick Center, the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn, you have deed theft going on, right? Black families are being dispossessed of the deeds to their house by certain real estate developers through the aid of the New York Police Department. So that's a type of accruing of wealth. This is what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. It's a fancy way of saying get rich by stealing from somebody else. So that's an example of a structural advantage that white people enjoy in the United States context, not because they themselves have dispossessed other people of their wealth, but because as a structure that is historical and institutional and coming down to us through the ages, that wealth is rooted in these exploitative measures, right? And by the way, those exploitative measures um, transformed over time. If you're not familiar with Michelle Alexander's brilliant work, The New Jim Crow, about racial blindness, about racial caste in the era of color blindness, read that book, right? Read that book. It's very accessible and it shows the historical continuity that chattel slavery and the racial caste, as in a caste system, that was implied in the system of American chattel slavery, that it was never dismantled. It only changed form, right? Down to the present where we have the war on drugs, and that's a different class. So I'll just keep going. But white privilege from this illicit structural advantage, both historic and ongoing, can remain intact and unthreatened. A lot of the reason why, and we saw this with Black Lives Matter, in 2020, 2021, when we had this huge social movement throughout the country, We had people saying defund the police. We had people saying, blue lives matter. And you had these two ends of the spectrum. One of the things that we saw from the Blue Lives Matter camp, and again, for those who may not know, Blue Lives Matter, referring to the uniform of police officers. So the response to saying Black Lives Matter was to say that police officers' lives matter as well or as much, right? Which police officers are not killed at the rate that unarmed Black people are by police. So, it wasn't necessarily the best response. But one of the things that we saw with those arguments that were made at that time and still is that there's a threat to the social order when police reform is talked about, right? And if you read Alex Vitale's work about on the end of policing, you'll see that the police as an institution in the American context grew out of the bounty catchers, right? Grew out of the slave catchers, because enslaved Africans were considered the property of the people who, owned them. And so the police come out of this, right, in a very direct way. The institution of the American police comes from slave catchers catching runaway slaves and returning them to their masters. And so today, middle class Americans who feel, because the police are there to protect private property, right? That's their mandate, essentially, underneath the other functions and kind of community values that are also part of policing. Underneath is this very essential fact. They're there to protect private property. And private property has had certain patterns in the United States, which were always intimately consistent with white supremacy. People who today feel threatened because they're middle class and they own property, when other people talk about reforming the police, this helps to explain some of that. So that's just one example, I think, of what Mills is saying here in the second box. If we continue, mainstream American political philosophy ignores these realities. As we said in the previous slide, Mills was critiquing the discourse. And all of this together helps to maintain the tradition of white supremacy, right? So white supremacy is not being unseated from its place. It's not being unsettled or problematized because there's so much in the system that is helping to support it and perpetuate it. Now, the meta dimension of political philosophy, and you'll recall meta means above and beyond, it means transcendentally, like beyond. Number one, the drawing of the boundaries of the political is itself a political act. Now, this we can thank, and we're fresh off of our class on bell hooks and kind of the feminist organizing in the 1970s and 80s and 90s and some of the thinking during those decades. But we can thank the feminist scholarship for providing us with this insight. When we talked about the personal is political, which was an adage that came to us from feminist organizing, the idea was patriarchy doesn't just exist out there in the world, in the law, at workplaces, and on the street. It also exists in the home, in the family. Think about the public-private dichotomy, right? The United States operates under that dichotomy, and the private realm is the realm of a Rawlsian private belief as opposed to public reason in the public realm. And feminists were saying it's not enough that we win a particular policy with respect to like maternal leave or job security in the case of pregnancy or access to medical care, but rather the personal is political, right? So that which is personal, if a woman wants to challenge patriarchy in the space of her church or in the space of her home, two spaces that are traditionally considered to be private realm and not the business of public reason, if a woman wants to do that, that's a political act, right? Patriarchy as a system encompasses both the public and the private dichotomy. So, when we say we're not going to talk about this in political science because this is not political, that itself is a political act, is what Mills is saying. More recently, there have been challenges by post-colonial theory and queer theory, but this has not really penetrated the main edifice of philosophical discourse, according to Mills. Now, when it comes to social justice theory, according to Mills, should be reconnected to its real world roots, which is to correct the justices that actually occur in society. It's not enough for thinking and theorizing and thought and philosophy to just stay at this lofty level, floating above reality, locked up in an ivory tower, just doing these intellectual exercises, these academic exercises. That's important on its own level, But it's really important, according to Mills, that social justice theory come back down, right? Come outside, right? Come down to the ground and just really reconnect with the injustices that are actually happening and then do something about that. Segregation has had deep cognitive consequences and more familiar consequences for chances at a good education, home ownership in good neighborhoods, being able to escape gang violence, etc. There are so many, like this is its own class. This is its own undergraduate course to talk about race in America and looking at like the 19th and 20th centuries and looking at some of the structures and processes and institutions and norms and values. Anytime a politician gets elected on a tough on crime platform, that is related to racialization and criminalization of Black people and brown people in America. There's just so much that we can say. There's inequalities in education, and the work I always cite for that one is Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol, and just showing that there have always been two Americas. There still are two Americas. And this breaks down not just according to poverty versus wealth, but that this breaks down racially according to white and non-white. And we have a lot of brown people who are able to move into the middle class, move into property ownership, move into college education, because they are able to access what's called honorary whiteness within the system of white supremacy. And I won't go into that because that would be a different topic. But what Mills is saying here is that, we had segregation in the United States. Legally and officially it may have ended, but de facto, and through other legal means, which are perhaps not as explicit, that continues, right? There's gerrymandering, there's redistricting, right? There's drawing the boundaries of school districts in order to keep people racially segregated, right? Um, and there's so many studies that support this point that Mills is making. So it doesn't always mean that the Black majority is going to be right. Right. Mills is not suggesting that to be Black, you're going to have the right answer, because the opposite of that would be the white supremacist notion that if you're white, you have the right answer. He's not saying just take white supremacy and turn it upside down and flip it over, right, and put Black majority opinion at the top. That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is that the perspective of those people who are subject to the inequalities of the system is going to be realistic, right? So go back for a second to what I was saying earlier with John Rawls and the veil of ignorance. What Mills is saying is, in this system, says Mills, whites have an unrepresentative group experience and a vested group interest in upholding the status quo. That second part, the vested group interest in upholding the status quo, we already discussed a little bit when I was mentioning, um, people's reactions to reforming or defunding the police slogans and mantras, that there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction that would be bad. And that's because we own property, and the property makes us anxious. And the first part, whites having an unrepresentative group experience, I want you to think just for a moment about the fact that when we talk about race, and there is, by the way, such a thing as white studies, right? White, like race studies pertaining to people who are white. But that is not what comes to mind. That's the smallest portion of what comes to mind when people in an American context think about race and talk about race and try to think through these things. White people are considered the default. They're not considered to have a racial experience, right? They're considered to have an unencumbered, kind of unadulterated experience as the default white race, because we live in a white supremacist system that poses whites as default, whites as the primary referent in history. In the previous class with Chandra Mahanti, I was saying that she poses that the West is the primary reference in a lot of feminist literature of history. Well, in this case, in Charles Mills, white people as a group who benefit from white supremacy privilege, even though they may not consciously contribute to it, they end up having that unrepresentative group experience because their experience is considered universal, their experience is considered default, and it doesn't represent the experience of others. In the racial contract, in this work, Mills is making the point that it is the language of social contract that mitigates this relationship of full human persons to sub persons. White people are considered full persons. people of color are considered sub-persons or less than fully human persons. And, you can look at just some of the dehumanizing language that has been used over the past, um, in the recent months and years, not only around, what President Trump had to say about Haitians, but also, or what he said in his first term about, people who come from Muslim majority countries, but also, what the Israeli administrators and statesmen have said about Palestinians. They're using animalistic language and they're not using the language of full personhood. White supremacy continues to be the overarching system that provides value to that kind of talk and that kind of policy making, right? So those who count as full persons and those who count as less than fully human are held together in society and politically through the language of the social contract. And this is why Mills names his work The Racial Contract, because he's playing off the Western liberal political concept of the social contract.